I'm really excited about this group that we're bringing together. You know, one of the things that has really emerged over the last year is that COVID-19 has thrust certain financing needs into the forefront that maybe weren't as top of mind last year. And I think chief among those is the issue of debt and the need for debt relief, as we've seen sort of mounting debts in the wake of this crisis and an increasing number of countries struggling to finance their response as they, you know, try to continue to make debt payments. We've seen a number of efforts from the IMF, from the G20, et cetera. And so in this conversation, we're going to talk about debt. We're going to talk about, you know, efforts to boost government spending. We're going to hear about Angola's experience. And we're also going to talk about what this moment has meant for entrepreneurs and for private companies. And so it's my pleasure now to introduce you to our panel. We have Ceyla Pazarbasioglu, who's the Director of Strategy, Policy and Review with the International Monetary Fund. We have Tokunboh Ishmael, the co-founder and managing director of Alitheia Capital. And we have Aia-Eza de Silva, who's the Secretary of State for Budget and Public Investment of the Republic of Angola. So thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have this rock star panel of women to help kick off our day. And the opening question I wanted to pose for all of you is really, you know, you each sit in sort of a unique position. And so I'm curious, as you look at the COVID response to date, what do you think has been one of the things that has worked particularly well? And where are some of the efforts falling short? And Aia-Eza, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, for us this afternoon, I know that for some of you, it's good morning. When you ask what has been going particularly well, you are talking about the as a whole, or to talk to us from our own experience?
Yes, absolutely. So from your experience in Angola, I'm curious, you know, I mean, one of the things that has been interesting is that you have managed to negotiate some debt relief with creditors, and including with China. And so I'm curious, sort of from your perspective, what has that experience been like? Where have the challenges been in getting that done?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking then. We have been some things going very well for us, actually. As you guys know, we are under a program with the IMF. We just had our third revision approved, and that was very, very helpful for us. Because one of the main factors they were debating with us was our debt sustainability levels. So we had it approved. It means that our debts is still sustainable, and that was a relief. However, as you mentioned, countries like ours are just drowning in debt, and we have this huge service to perform, and the revenues are really falling short. We have a dependency on a main commodity for our budget revenue, and these commodity prices have been falling since this started, and it has come to the historically low prices. Today, the market is performing more or less, but still we have been under a huge financial pressure in order to keep ourselves performing reasonably well. So having that approved by the IMF was actually very important to us. We also have this ongoing talking with China, which is our main international creditor, And it also has been going fairly well regarding the circumstances we are trying to negotiate it. It's not easy for us. It's not easy for them as a creditor. So we have still ongoing calls going on. We also have the DSSI initiative for the G20, and also very well managed and followed by the IMF, which has been, and I have to congratulate Ceyla as the only representative of the institution here, because they have been very keen and doing all on their power to put the countries together and make them really correspond more and more to that initiative. So we cannot say that everything is a failure, right? However, we have to say we are not very rich countries. We do not have these great packages of helping coming to us. We are in a situation where we have still to pay the debt that we owe, and this is something that is very important to do. So it's not something that it's, and we have the shortness of revenues. So it's not something that it's very easy to manage. What have we been done? We have been cutting expenditure. We have been delaying contracts. We have suspended contracts. We have been making sure that we have our finances on track, and also putting together a lot of reforms in terms of better controlling the expenditure, and making sure that each penny is spent, it's well spent and efficiently spent. So this is what we have been doing. I heard your conversation on the opening remarks, and I was actually very pleased to hear that people in the private sector, people in the private finance are also moving very closely with this issue, because all the help is welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. Ceyla, I want to go to you now, and you obviously have a broad view of what's going on, and we talked a little bit, we just heard from Aya about the specific situation in Angola and the ongoing challenges despite some of the relief through the debt service suspension initiative of the G20, et cetera. And I think the question for you that I have is, we're entering in this next month, we're expecting a special meeting and a meeting of the G20 to really look at a framework for broader debt restructuring. I think what is clear is that, a delay of debt payments will not be sufficient for a lot of countries. So tell us about where we stand. What do you think those framework discussions will look like? What does a good debt, restructuring framework look like as we move forward?
Thank you, Adva, and it's a privilege to be with this great panel. Big reformers, Angola, we heard about just now, and also to Devex. So I just want to step back for a minute. If you look at what has been the response to this crisis, you saw about $12 trillion in support to firms and households, major central banks coming in with interest rate cuts and other measures amounting to $7.5 trillion. And I'm mentioning this because it's very different than the global financial crisis in 2008. We had this unprecedented shock and unprecedented response. But it's very uneven. So advanced economies are doing whatever it takes. They have injected something like 20% of GDP. But then when you look at emerging markets and low-income countries, they're doing whatever they can. And with support from us and others, it's 6% of GDP for emerging markets, 2% of GDP for low-income countries. So the response has been very uneven. And that really requires everyone to support this, because otherwise we're going to have a lost decade in many countries. And that's just not fair, nor does it make economic sense. Private sector has responded as well. We have seen emerging markets issue like $124 billion between January and June, so they were able to issue. But again, it's not for all. In sub-Saharan Africa, no one has issued any debt. So I'm putting this in perspective because the situation is dire. It's very uncertain, as we keep saying. At the fund, we have provided financing to 81 countries, $31 billion in emerging financing to 76 countries in a very agile and quick way to support countries so that they can make these important health and other payments. We, in terms of the common framework, why is that important? Because you don't want countries to delay necessary expenditures for growth going forward, because debt sustainability requires growth as well. So how do we make sure the debt suspension initiative was good? It allowed countries to defer payments. It allowed them space to make these important health and economic expenditures at a time when revenues are falling, as was just mentioned. And the common framework goes beyond that. It brings all creditors together, all official creditors, whether they're Paris Club or non-Paris Club, together to agree on the parameters for any reprofiling or restructuring of debt. And that's very important because in the DSSI, we kept saying, everyone talking about bringing in the private sector, comparable treatment, but that hasn't materialized. There are many reasons for that. We can go into that if needed. But the point is the common framework, which is in principle agreed and should be hopefully endorsed by in November, is to bring all official creditors together to agree on the terms so that the private sector also participates and we have comparable treatment.
Thanks. Tokunboh, I want to turn to you. Can you sort of share with us that, what are you seeing in terms of the companies you're investing in terms of your ability to raise capital? Have you seen things change at all over the course of this crisis? And what do you need? What do the businesses you're investing in need at this point? You're muted, Tokunboh.
Sorry, thank you. So as Alitheia Capital, for us, it was quite interesting because we raised a fund just before the pandemic and we brought on some new investors just as the lockdowns were happening. So we were in a good place. And we were also glad and fortunate to see that the strategy that we have, where we're looking at investing in companies that are providing access to essential services, health being a key one, education being key, energy being key, all three sectors that were very key for households, especially in Nigeria and South Africa during this lockdown period. So for us, it was confirmation, not that we needed it, but again, for the naysayers, it was confirmation of the need for our kinds of strategy of investing for more than just financial returns. So what that meant was that obviously the kind of companies that we're looking at suddenly were put into play in terms of needing to be at the forefront of responding to COVID. So of course, healthcare, I don't need to say much about that. And having the financing to be able to provide the PPE that was then distributed into the markets was very key for some of our our pipeline companies. For some of our portfolio companies, though, they had to pivot because suddenly their business models, especially where there was a huge physical aspect to their business models, were under threat. So even if you're an essential service, if the people can't get to you, then that's an issue. So the good thing as well, though, is that because we focus on how we can leverage tech to make essential services accessible and affordable, it meant that a good part of our pipeline and our portfolio were able to weather the storm. Some of the interesting aspects for us were those that had to pivot because their model was suddenly put at play because of the lockdown. And we saw examples of that both with some logistics companies that we invested in that moved from passenger transportation to goods transportation as e-commerce took off. Digital loans, we saw actually an increase in the disbursement of those loans because they don't need the infrastructure, but the people were able to gain access to money and therefore have money put into their electronic wallets. So, and then also even for one of our companies where they did have both the digital aspect, but also a physical aspect, the physical aspect, which is an agent network, was in the communities, right where people were. And so they were able to step up as an essential service and provide cash where needed because they were cheek by jowl in those communities. So for us, what we've seen is that, you know, first of all, what it revealed is the huge gap in investment that has not gone into essential services, you know, and the secretary was talking about how money is going to countries, but the question is how accountable is that money and those investments? And what we see is that by being able to be intentional about the kind of impact that we want to have with money, we can raise the accountability on how money is deployed.
Great. And so I will come back to you, Aia-Eza, and sort of with that question, you talked about one of the things that you're doing in this period is looking at reforms and looking how to improve spending. And so I want to push you on that a little bit. What are some of those things that you've done? How are you ensuring greater accountability? I imagine this likely will be a part of some of the debt discussions going forward to ensure that, you know, any sort of debt restructuring or repayments comes along with reforms. And so I'm curious from, you know, to hear a little bit more about those reforms, and then also to hear about, you know, you said you were cutting funding, and I'm curious where you're cutting that funding. And I think one of the trends we've seen is that sometimes funding to services like education and health are being cut, which can be especially difficult at this time. So those are the two questions. Hopefully I can get sort of short responses to each from you about what those reforms you're doing look like and what that new accountability system will be, and then where some of those funding cuts are coming.
Well, let me just assure you that all the cuts we have been done, we have very closely do fall very short from cutting from education and health. We actually have increased this spending on the last 3 or 4 years as never before. We are doing a lot of investment, especially in the health sector. So the cutting has not go for the social sector, as we call them. And the reason, as you mentioned, we face challenges on these sectors every day. And if we did have more money, we would put more money there. So we cannot afford to not spend on those sectors. But we have been cutting on other equally and strategically important sectors like infrastructure, roads, railroads, and so on. And those are equally important for the development processes. Yeah. But if we do not have how to pay, we cannot just afford to keep on doing things.
Have to make difficult choices. And so on the reforms that you're making, what sort of accountability reforms are you making at this point, and how much of that is sort of required through some of the debt discussions that you're having?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, also we and someone on the Q&A also have mentioned, we Angolans are not really. For many years, we were known for having this huge and very corrupt government. And as you know, today we have been doing a lot in terms of trying to make sure that we fight this very very pandemic situation that we have faced for many years. And as you understand, it's not something very easy to do because it's something that is in here. So we have to make sure that things are done, but we still have to keep on working on other issues. But if you go to our program and the IMF has it published, we have a sort of named most of the initiatives that have been going on. In terms of public finance, I can mention to you 2 or 3. We have put together a system where, and the Tokunboh also addressed a little bit on that, where we can actually make sure that all the projects have been on a proper, I don't know how to put it in English, but you have to bid for being able to conquer and to win the project that the public sector is developing. We also put together a system where we can do it iteratively, so people that are very far away can also be able to participate and not just being allocated to 2 or 3 main players that always play and always win all the contracts. We also have made sure that we put together, and because we did that, for example, in the health sector, we have been having projects that in the past would be having a price that is like 3 or 4 times greater than it is today. So prices are really coming down. We are also making sure that a lot is done in terms of the prices that are being played in the public sector. So if projects are just usually priced, they are just not implemented. They have to go for a second evaluation before we are able to go forward with them. But again, you are in a hurry, right? And we have other people to talk. But if you go to our program, I have other documents I could show, but if you go to our program, because it's published and the IMF has it on its website, you can see the many initiatives we already had and that we are also developing with them in terms of transparency, in terms of making sure that fiscal accounts are more organized and better published.
Great. Ceyla, I want to come back to you. We've talked a lot about debt, but one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is, the other sort of role the IMF is playing is to try to free up some additional liquidity. And one of the ways that the IMF could do that is through SDRs, and which are special drawing rights. And I think that one of the things we've seen in the G20 negotiations is that there's a real holdup right now in terms of a new issuance. But there's also lots of talk about how could you get some of the world's wealthier countries to donate unused SDRs from the last issuance. So tell me a little bit about what is sort of holding back the SDR discussion today. I understand the US government has made some objections in these discussions. And where do we stand in terms of creating vehicles for using those unused SDRs to provide additional liquidity and capital to countries that need it?
Yeah. So, of course, the priority for us is to make the most vulnerable members can manage the crisis and strengthen their recovery. And we have been fast, agile, and pragmatic to be able to help countries and really concentrated on measures that can be put in place quickly and are most likely to be successful, such as improving our existing instruments and expanding our toolkit. Since March, we provided financing, as I said before, to 81 countries, of which 48 are low-income countries, amounting to over $100 billion. So our lending commitment now is over 280 billion, with additional room for member countries to tap into the IMF's $1 trillion lending capacity through programs. So we have the firepower, if you like, to support member countries, especially those that are most vulnerable. We provided debt relief, which is now extended under the Catastrophic Containment and Relief Trust, which helps the poorest and the most vulnerable members, about 28 of them, with a total debt relief for the first, this has been about $500 million. Now, in terms of the general allocation of SDRs, we have many countries that have expressed interest in them, but the support for a new allocation falls short of the 85% voting majority that we need. So we have been focusing pragmatically how to better use existing SDRs. Several countries have already been providing loan resources for the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, the PRGT. By using their SDR holdings since the start of the crisis, we raised $21 billion in new PRGT loan resources, and about 2/3 has come from existing use of SDRs. Just to also put it in perspective, a general SDR allocation, say $500 billion, low-income countries, because of the quota, could receive about equivalent of 3.3% of it. So in line with the quotas, that's about 16.5 billion. So we really, so it's pragmatic to focus on what we have, use what we have, which is really, we are able to support countries. And I want to add one thing quickly, Adva, because this was a great point that was brought up by both panelists, which is the need for accountability and transparency, both debt transparency and investment transparency. This is so critical. And supporting these measures with capacity development, public sector, private sector, procurement reforms, as was mentioned, is really transformational. So I cannot agree more that this is top priority for us. Transparency, debt transparency, and we have many countries that are reforming and they want to reform. So I really appreciate that this point was made.
Great. Tokunboh, I want to come back to you, and you talked about how so many of the companies you're investing in are sort of based in a digital infrastructure, and we've gotten a couple questions come in about sort of digitization and both what governments can do to create an enabling environment for some of that digital infrastructure, and how it's changing and services are being designed. And so wanted to throw those questions to you before we wrap up here.
Easy answer on what governments can do: infrastructure, power infrastructure. If you look at the ease of doing business, getting electricity to do business is a big issue. And especially if we're talking about digitization, you need power. So power reforms, I can't speak enough about that. And the ease of getting connected to the grid or even to an off-grid solution is something that needs to be looked at. Really, I don't think there's any business that's waking up each day nowadays, especially post-COVID, that's not thinking, how can I reduce the physicality of my business, or how can I bring in digitization to improve the physicality of my business? And so we're seeing that, whereas maybe a year, 18 months ago, the amount of the use of funding that was going towards digital or tech infrastructure was maybe even 10% of what we're seeing today now, where when people are raising funding, they're definitely already thinking, and it's part of the heart of core of what they're thinking they want to use their funds towards, is how can I make my business more ubiquitous? How can I bulletproof it against these kind of physical issues? We're seeing more of that. So it goes without saying, digitization is upending that whole narrative.
I wanted to ask one more question to you, Tokunboh, and one of the challenges, especially sort of early in this crisis, that I was hearing a lot about from DFIs is sort of some of the challenges of doing due diligence. And I wonder, as an organization in country, who's on the continent of Africa, what you've seen in terms of the demands on your time, in terms of activating your networks, in terms of doing some of this, and what you think, is there an opportunity there for local fund managers that's growing in the wake of this crisis?
No, absolutely. Local fund managers are key. I mean, DFIs and foreign fund managers are seeing that you need presence on the ground, you need proximity to understand the problems, and you need proximity to be able to proffer the solutions. DD, a lot of us have tried to do that online, but there's only so much that you can do online. You still need to have the ability to go in to kick the tires. So to the extent that people can't fly into the continent, the local fund managers have a place. But what I would say is that we also need more domestic capital to encourage the growth of that local fund management market, so that the domestic capital, the domestic limited partners can partner with the development finance that's coming into the country. But all in all, whether it's foreign direct investment, development finance, or whether it's local LPs, at the end of the day, accountability. How is the money being spent? How is it having an impact? COVID has shown us that we can't just spend the money or deploy the money. We need to make sure that there's impact in these essential sectors of the economy. Otherwise, we're all toast.
So we've got about 1 minute left, and Ceyla, I want to come to you. We had a question come in asking if there is a general allocation of $500 billion in SDRs. Are there existing IMF mechanisms for shareholders that don't need them to transfer their holdings to low-income countries and lower middle-income countries? And what would it take for that to happen? And like I said, we've got 1 minute left, so.
Yeah, I mentioned already, so yes, we have been doing this allocation of SDRs for the PRGT countries, 21 billion already. So yes.
That mechanism could also be used if there's a new allocation.
Of course, yeah.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank all of you so much for being part of this panel. It's been great to hear all of your perspectives. So thank you so much for your time today.